Hey there, and welcome to Table to Stage. I'm Jordan Werma, and this is my podcast. It is my continuing mission to explore creativity through the stories and the experiences of creators from my home state of Connecticut and around the wider world. Today's creator is Derek Askey. He is an assistant editor at The Sun magazine. If you've never heard of The Sun, you're probably not alone. It's a small, independent publication based in North Carolina that got started back in 1974 with a $50 loan. It's really a wonderful source for creativity, ranging from photography to journalism to poetry and more. The Sun is a unique publication, particularly in today's world. So let's hear all about it from Derek Askey.
I am from just south of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I grew up south of the city in the country, and I went to the University of Pittsburgh for my undergraduate.
Okay.
And then lived there for some years afterwards. So I was in Pittsburgh for about 7 years, in the city proper for 7 years before I left.
Yeah. What did you study at Pittsburgh?
Creative writing.
Oh.
So that has been my focus for as long as I can remember, I guess. Since I was in high school, really, I knew that I wanted to kind of be a part of the world of letters.
Yeah. Did you start out like with prose or poetry, or what was your gateway
prose.
into the writing?
Yeah, prose was definitely the gateway and has remained my focus since then. I like poetry and read some poetry, but I would not consider myself an expert there. I'm definitely more prose.
Yeah. Was there a specific author or style of writing that you were drawn to initially?
That's a great question. I remember there being sort of separate realms for me. I was a voracious reader, and I remember like my first sort of like favorite adult book was The Shining by Stephen King.
Oh, yeah.
I had been into, I might be showing my age here maybe, but I was really into the Goosebumps books.
Okay.
When I was a kid, and sort of like scary stories like that. And somehow I went from like Goosebumps books to Stephen King, which is like, I'm sure there was a transition there, but I don't really remember it. I just remember like reading that book when I was on vacation with my family, reading it at the beach, and thinking like, realizing that I had no idea that you could do things like that in a book.
Yeah.
And you could say things that you couldn't have a conversation about with your parents or something like that. So it was huge for me. It was like, it just like opened the floodgates. And then I read a bunch of Stephen King books and then kind of moved beyond that as I, became a teenager and things. But that was, I remember that book just like really bowling me over. I think it was in the interiority of the characters that you got to see inside Jack Torrance's head. And
Sure, yeah.
All the characters who were in it, because if I remember correctly, they each had like their own sort of chapters, and that was it.
That's funny because you start with R.L. Stine and went to The Shining, and I started with John Bellairs and went to the Dark Tower Stephen King book.
Oh, great! Yeah, yeah.
So it's very similar kind of jumping off point and to the same author, but it's sort of a different genre.
Totally.
So what was it about? Like, because I know most writers start out as readers to some degree, usually voracious readers, but not every reader goes on to be a writer. So what was it about the stories that you were reading that told you maybe you had stories of your own to contribute?
Yeah, I think it just, it became the thing that interested me the most and sort of pushed everything else to the side. I remember this moment where what I was reading at home on my own and what I was reading in school, like finally, I was reading things at school that interested me. And I remember that happened when we got to the 1920s and we read T.S. Eliot.
Okay.
And I know I just said that I'm not very into poetry, but I remember that being another sort of touchstone for me.
Yeah.
That all of a sudden, like, here was this thing that I was really interested in, and you got to do it in school. It just seemed like so much cooler to me that that those two worlds could intersect.
Yeah.
And so when I was a kid, like I said, I grew up in the country, and you sort of had to create your own entertainment. And my brother and I were both really into films also, pretentious about it in the way that teenagers, of course, are, and put together this thing that was called the Askey Film Festival. My last name is Askey. And the first year it was very hand to mouth. We had like no budget whatsoever, and it was basically me and my buddies making movies and showing them at what we called this film festival. And we had, a couple dozen people come. And then we did it another year, and somehow it kind of got more popular, and then we got covered in the newspaper, and we had these people from New York and somewhere in the South. Somehow they had heard about this film festival that these high school kids were putting on, and they sent us their tapes that we then aired at this film festival. We had these bands come play. Like I was really into writing and books, but I was also into making films too when I was a kid. And they weren't good, like by any stretch of the imagination. They were really bad.
I mean, what age are we talking about here?
I would say it was like 15, 16, something like
Oh,
that.
boy, wow.
And I don't really even know how that we became so interested in those things. But like I said, I grew up in the country, and we kind of had to make our own entertainment. We had to find ways to entertain ourselves. And so the films and the writing, I feel like those sort of happened at the same time. That films were hard to make, and you needed your friends, and you needed money to do it. And that was a really satisfying creative act to do with a group of people. And then as their interest sort of waned, well, I could just write stories. That's precisely what I did.
How many years running was the Askey Film Festival?
Well, you've heard both of them,
Okay.
all 2 years
All
of
right.
it. Because my brother went away to college, and it was his brainchild, and he has this very sort of big, gregarious personality, and can get people to donate money to a film festival that some kids are putting on. And that just wasn't me. I was more interested in like making movies maybe that might have gotten shown there. So once he left, the Askey Film Festival died, but we still have the T-shirts, so we know that it existed.
Well, if there's no T-shirt to commemorate it, did it really happen?
Exactly. I think I still have my name tag too, if I can
nice.
remember correctly.
So when the film festival stopped after the many years, what was your next purposeful foray into storytelling? Was it short stories? Was it?
Yeah, it was short stories. I remember after he left, I think I had 2 years left of high school, and that was I guess I got more serious about it then, because we stopped making movies as much. And yeah, we were writing short stories. I also wrote poems, these terrible nature poems. I think I did a whole I remember a binder. I had a binder of nature poems.
Okay.
And so I did some of that, but poetry was not my strong suit, and stories seemed more interesting to me. Stories were what novels and things like that were what I had fallen in love with, narrative.
So what sort of stories did you first start out writing?
What a great question.
Did you have a genre that you were drawn to? I mean, it seems like horror would be the natural thing if R.L. Stine and Stephen King were there.
And that would have made sense. I probably should have stuck with that. But no, it went to what I guess you would have to describe as literary.
Okay.
And I think I was maybe just a very self-serious 16, 17-year-old kid. So I still loved horror movies and things like that, but I actually don't think I ever tried to write horror stories. I know that probably sounds strange because of the examples that I gave, but I think I went right to sort of literary, all of the mistakes that you make as a young writer. You have characters pacing a room, smoking cigarettes, and being really serious. It was like things like that.
Yeah, like something out of a Snoopy
There weren't
cartoon.
a lot of, yeah, there should have been more plot. I think plot was the hard part. And so I did that, and I applied to the University of Pittsburgh because they had a good writing program and it was close to home. And I submitted a story. It was like just this little vignette. I haven't thought about it in years now, but I'm sure it was terrible. But they thought it wasn't so terrible that I couldn't get in. So I got into the school and knew that going in that was what I wanted to do.
Did you have ideas that when you finished with college that you would just become a writer, or did you have a different plan in place?
I think maybe when I was in high school, I thought, you go to college and then you become a writer. And when I was in college, I think the reality or the impossibility of achieving that, or the very, some people do, but that's so rare.
Right.
So I was also very practical about it. So when I was in college, I also got this public and professional writing certificate, which was like sort of closer to grant writing. I was trying to be practical while I was acknowledging that I was getting a sort of very impractical degree. And to their credit, my parents, not once did they sort of try to discourage me from following that. They were just excited that I was, pursuing this thing that I was interested in and getting good grades while I was doing it. So I tried to do practical things and knew that there wasn't a job exactly that would be satisfied by just having an undergraduate degree in writing. I wasn't just thinking like, I'll just sit down at a typewriter and dash off these things and get universal acclaim.
Right.
I don't think that happened.
Well, first of all, where are you going to find a typewriter these days?
Exactly. Yeah. And I don't like writing by hand. I'm very much someone who types.
Okay. I've recently discovered that there's still a large group of writers who write longhand, and it's just fascinating to me that people still do that.
I was just complaining about this to a friend of mine because I had this class, and actually it was with an instructor who I'm still close with and I still love. She's great, so don't tell her I told you this. But
okay, yeah, this doesn't go anywhere but between us.
Okay, perfect. One of the assignments of the class was that you had to keep this sort of handwritten journal where you were writing by longhand things that were occurring to you throughout the day and things like that as sort of the pre-work of writing a story. And I hated doing that. And I was much faster to get my thoughts down on a page if I was just typing. And so that's what I did. I would type them up. But the assignment was that it had to be handwritten, so I would just read what I had typed and hand wrote it into this little booklet and told her that I had actually written it.
That's great. At what point did you decide, I'm going to get this degree, I'm going to follow this course, but I'm going to have to find a career that may not necessarily be as the writer that I, initially thought maybe would happen?
So once I had finished school, I had a job as a business analyst at a health insurance company, which is as exciting as it sounds. And I basically had that job it was the job, I had an internship there when I was in college, and it helped to pay for my tuition when I was there. And then, of course, you graduate from college and you have a lot of debt, as I'm sure a lot of people do. And so I stayed at that job to help me pay off my undergraduate debt. And I knew while I was doing that the sort of ultimate goal, the next step, I guess, not ultimate goal, but next step was to get an MFA. And not every writer does that, and I know writers who don't have them, but to me, that was what I wanted to do, and that was what I felt like was a necessary step for me. And so I think I worked at that job for 4 years or 3 years or something like that until I had paid off the debt that I had accumulated while I was in school. And then I had applied to MFA programs and went and did that next step. And again, I didn't quite know what that career looked like. But I remember a day, I worked in this high-rise building in downtown Pittsburgh. And I remember one day I was there early and I was the only one in the office. And I remember looking out the window and like thinking about what that career was. And I didn't know what it was, but I knew that I would probably have to get an MFA if I wanted to have a chance at getting it. And so that's what I did, and ended up moving very far away from Pittsburgh. You will never hear me talk more warmly about a city than I talk about Pittsburgh. It is my favorite place. And I never thought I would leave there, and I did to go get this degree. I moved to Fort Collins, Colorado, and that was a really big step, but it felt like I was doing it, to achieve this goal that I was trying to achieve.
Is that Colorado State out there?
It is, yeah.
Okay. Now, even if you didn't know what the career was, though, did you have a feeling? Like, was there a door that you thought might open for you once you completed that master's?
Well, I knew, I was still writing too. So it would be sort of wrong to say I just did that for a career. I did it because I wanted to become a better writer.
Right.
And I hoped that, having that degree might might open a door that would not be open to someone who just had an undergraduate. And again, I just want to clarify that that was what I ended up doing, but in no way do I think that that's what everybody has to do. I know people who have a lot of success that they don't have MFAs.
Yeah.
But for me, at least at that time, maybe it was because I was young. I was like, oh, I had to do this if I want to do that. And I just love the idea of having 3 years to dedicate to writing and to have people who were really serious about it and getting to spend a lot of time with those people. So I was really excited to get to do it.
Yeah. Did you get to be a part of, some sort of a writer's community while you were studying?
Yeah, I did it in sort of, I would say in fits and starts when I was an undergrad and in those years after. I had some friends who I made in the writing classes that I was in, and we exchanged work sort of outside of the classroom. And they were people who I trusted, and I'm really pleased to say that I'm still friends with them. And so, it was hard to kind of maintain that out of college because people moved away, but I did still do it. I was still plugging away at writing stories and trying to make them better. I also had some really, really, really good instructors when I was at Pitt who were good enough to read my writing that I was working on and help me as I was applying to programs and stuff. And so they were always what I thought of as my superiors. But they were kind enough to read my writing, and I felt sort of accountable to them. And then when I went to Colorado State, it was like that times 10, because I had instructors who just offered really good criticism and feedback on the writing that I was doing, as well as a group of writers who were also in the program who I just felt like were this really close community of writers. That was the reason that I went to that school. There was this book that this guy published, I think it was the year before I applied. It was called the MFA Handbook. And it was this ranking of the best programs in the country and how to apply to these programs and all of that stuff. And they had like little write-ups about each of the programs. And the one about Colorado State really emphasized the community that was there, that it was a tight-knit community. And that sounded really appealing to me. And so I applied and was so glad that they wanted to have me there with them. And so, I definitely had a community there.
Now, as an aspiring writer, I'm assuming that, the pieces that you had been putting together, you were shopping around or submitting to different publications. Were you looking to be published at this time?
If I was smarter, I would have been doing that. And I didn't, I'm so embarrassed to admit that, but I wasn't really sending work out because I just didn't feel like I was, I was all that good yet. And I wasn't, and, I wasn't sending work out in the way that I knew people who same age, same skill level, whatever you want to say, and they were doing it. And I admire and continue to admire those people, but I was not great at submitting work. I'm not a good example of someone who engages in the writing community in that way. And then by the time I got to grad school, I was sending out a bit more, but I was still pretty lousy at it, to be totally honest with you. And even now, I don't feel like I'm so hot at it either. Some of those pieces have sort of lain dormant for a while, and I haven't sent things out in quite a bit. So
what kind of publications were you looking at though for the ones you did submit?
Literary journals, places that were publishing the sort of non-genre short stories, poetry, nonfiction, and that's not a huge market, I guess, but I think of that as a really sort of supportive community as well. That conference that I had just mentioned is basically where all of those journals get together and talk about their publications to one another. And so it's always exciting to see this like really cool ecosystem of writers and editors and readers and stuff that are all sort of supporting each other. So maybe they don't have like the largest readerships, and my grandma probably wouldn't know the names of them. But in that community, they're very well known.
Well, there used to be, there were a dozen or more popular magazines where you'd be able to submit, a short story or even a serialized story. And over the last, 20 years or so, those have really diminished greatly. I'm not sure how many really exist anymore.
Yeah. I don't even know if does the Atlantic still publish fiction?
Oh, that one
I
might.
can't remember. Playboy,
Yeah.
had a lot of great short stories that were published throughout, I would say, like the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I don't know if they still publish fiction or not.
Well, there was
But yeah,
that magazine, George, was around for a while. They used to do a lot of writing.
Right. And the New Yorker, of course. But
yes,
I remember having heard this story, and it's probably apocryphal, but I had heard this story when I was an undergraduate, that at the New Yorker offices, there's this giant room that's just unsolicited manuscripts. It's just like floor to ceiling piled with unsolicited manuscripts.
I'll bet it's more than a room.
Yeah, it probably is at this point. So, to me, it seemed like I would have had a lot more confidence than I had to send out work to places like that. I was just like, well, I'm this guy who just graduated from school and stuff, so they're not in a million years going to be interested. And it's a cowardly thing to do, but I will say I was probably right about that.
Well, you'll never know now.
I'll never know.
So how did you initially get hooked up with the Sun?
Well, so I had finished my degree at CSU, and basically I was on deck to stay there and teach as an adjunct instructor. And that was sort of the plan, because I taught all 3 years when I was there, because that helped to pay my tuition. And I really enjoyed teaching when I was there, and the possibility of staying there and teaching for an indefinite amount of time sounded okay to me, because I didn't know exactly what I was going to do next anyway.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I had just met somebody, and we had known each other, I guess, just for a few months, and sort of had fallen very quickly in love. And she was a native North Carolinian and was moving back to North Carolina to finish her degree at UNC. So I had the option of staying and teaching and sort of staying in this world that I had sort of fought so hard to get back into, after years of working as a business analyst, and then finally you're back in this super supportive community.
Right.
So I would still have had my foot in that door there, or I could move sight unseen to North Carolina to be with this person who I had known for a few months.
Yeah.
And I did the sensible thing and moved to North Carolina.
Now, you had only, to this point, you had lived in Pittsburgh and
in Colorado.
So that was North Carolina's
never even been to the South.
North Carolina's a far cry from both of those places.
It really is. And I had no idea what I would be getting into. But I knew that I was in love with her.
Yeah.
And that I would regret it and would be a lousy teacher anyway if I was trying to stay there and manage that. And my advisor, Stephen, I had sort of told him this kind of like predicament that I was in, and he hesitated not a moment. He's like, "Oh yeah, move away, don't teach, go away, see what happens." He didn't even have to think about it. And so that's what I did. I moved to North Carolina and spent a lot of time in the library applying to jobs. Anything that was even remotely related to writing, I was applying to. And working at a grocery store while I was doing that. And eventually the position at the Sun had opened up, and they, I sent them my materials, and they sent me some back, and went through a sort of arduous interview process, a sort of multi-step interview process. They're very thorough hirers there. And the reason for that is because it's a small staff, and they have to make sure that they're getting sort of the right folks, the folks that they want.
Right.
And it worked out. And I ended up getting the job at the Sun and marrying that person who I had moved to North Carolina. And so now we're married and have a house. We live in Durham, and I work in Chapel Hill.
Oh, boy. Happy ending all around.
Yeah. It was very unlike me, I think, to do something like that, because I'm usually very cautious, and I just sort of knew that I would regret it if I didn't. So
yeah. So unfortunately, I think most of the people who are listening to this may be unfamiliar with what the Sun is. Now, it's been something that I've been familiar with since mid to late 80s, probably.
Oh, great.
Because my father had a subscription when I was young, and I used to read his copy after he was done with it. And I have a subscription to the magazine currently because my father got me one. And I have found it to be just chock full of wonderful writing and photography and everything every time I've ever encountered it.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering if you could maybe explain to people who are listening what the Sun is and why it's, because it is such a unique publication, especially when compared to what's available today.
Mm-hmm. It is, and I find it, for that reason, it's a difficult magazine to describe.
Yeah.
It was, so the Sun started in 1974. Our founder and editor, he's still the editor there, Askey, he had worked as a newspaper reporter and just decided that wasn't the sort of life that he wanted. It wasn't work that he found fulfilling. And so he quit that job, and a few years after that started the magazine with a $50 loan. He had moved to Chapel Hill.
$50?
Yeah, $50, right?
Okay, I don't know what's crazier, that you could start a magazine with $50 or that it had to be loaned.
Right, it had to be loaned. He had spent some time living abroad between quitting that job and had moved to North Carolina to be a part of an intentional community, which is not quite a commune exactly, but it's communal living. And so he did not have a lot of money, but his skill set was in words because he had a journalism background, and so he decided to start a magazine. And it was first, he sold it for a quarter on the streets in Chapel Hill.
Wow.
And improbably, it has survived to this day and is flourishing at this point.
I mean, improbably is probably a bit of an undersell on that, I think, right? I mean,
yeah,
when you start a magazine with $50, I mean, the fact that it's still going, 45 years later is pretty incredible.
Right. It really is incredible. And the thing that makes it sort of even more incredible and more improbable is that the magazine carries no advertisements whatsoever.
That's my favorite part.
Yeah, mine too. And so we're sustained entirely by our readers. We don't have ads. We have no ad revenue. And despite the fact that we're in Chapel Hill, we're not associated with the university at all either. So basically the magazine exists because of people like you, Jordan, actually the readers who have been supporting it for decades. We would not exist without subscriptions and donations that those people make.
Right.
And I think it stands alone for that reason, that because it doesn't have ads, we think of it as an intimate sort of space between the reader and the writer. And the work that we do at the magazine is to try to cultivate that sort of level that ads would just get in the way.
Yeah, I think that just the presentation of the magazine, that the way it's laid out, the way that it sort of grabs you right from the cover, because it's always this glorious photograph that really just draws you right into it, but it just grabs you and it makes you feel like you're a part of the magazine. And it's really like the word you used, intimate. It really is an intimate read every time. What is the content that you're looking for when you're putting this magazine together, and has it changed over the years, or has it been pretty consistent?
So we have, and I'm sorry to sort of rely on copy that we've put together, because we have these mailers that we send out to people to get them to subscribe. And in fact, I still remember getting a Sun mailer. I have no idea how I got on their list, but I got a Sun mailer when I was in high school maybe, or just like home from college, but I remember getting one of these Sun mailers. Anyway, that's beside the point. There's a little sort of spiel from Cy when he's talking about the magazine, and one of the lines that he has is that the human heart hasn't changed, and that maybe the war that we're in right now is different, or maybe our political situations are different, or the technology is different, but the human heart is still the same. And I think that that sort of thread has run through the magazine for as long as it's been in existence, and still continues to. There's a sort of inquisitiveness and honesty that's in the Sun I think that's what we value the most. And I don't know if this is the way that Cy would describe it, but for me, when I read a piece where I feel like the author is looking me in the eye, that seems like a Sun piece to me. That seems like a piece that belongs in the Sun.
Yeah.
And we're fortunate to have readers who connect with that type of honesty, because sometimes it's not always easy. Sometimes these pieces are about losing a child, or going through a substance abuse problem, or things like that. So it's not always the easiest content, the easiest writing for someone to read, but I think for those people who are hungry for that sort of thing and who value that sort of honesty and intimacy, the magazine really speaks to them in the same way that it speaks to us on the staff.
Now, one of the things that I've always found very interesting about the Sun is that, like, if I'm going through another magazine, doesn't even matter what it is, once I've kind of skimmed through it and pulled what I could out of it, whatever, like it would have some value to me, I never go back to that magazine. I mean, National Geographic might be an exception to that. But most magazines are you consume them and they're recycled. The Sun, on the other hand, I feel like I could skim through it and something might grab me, the day it comes in my mailbox. But the rest of it may not appeal to me immediately. But I know that at some point it's going to be something that could speak to me in a way that would be relevant at the time. So the idea of discarding one of the magazines is so just out of left field to me. Like, I can't imagine throwing one out, because it's this wonderful archive of journalism and prose and poetry and photography that is accessible, regardless of the date. Is that something that is a conscious thing when the issues are being put together?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that we strive to do is to sort of strike a balance between, the sort of like tagline of the Sun, I guess, is personal, political, provocative. And the provocative part, I would say, more often tends to come from the interview. And the interview, there's a sort of feature-length, long-form Q&A style interview that's at the beginning of each issue.
Yeah.
And in that space, we're trying to kind of engage with the sort of pressing social and political issues that we think our readers might be interested in reading about, and especially from people who they might not have ever heard of. We're excited by bringing those thinkers and scholars and whomever else to our readers.
Yeah.
And so in that part, I think that we're trying to make the magazine relevant to people who are reading it right now in 2019. But I think with the nonfiction and the poetry and the fiction, I don't know that our goal is exactly the same. We still want it engaging with those issues, but I think we do want it to do exactly what you're saying, which is that you can pick up an issue from 2006, and there's going to be writing in that issue, or photography for that matter, that you can connect with, and maybe it just wasn't right for you at the time, but you come back to it. So I do think we try to strike a balance between, I used this word at work the other day, and Cy was like, what does that word even mean? Writing that's evergreen.
Okay.
That's, is always going to be relevant, and then things that are sort of more of the moment.
Right. Now, as far as like the actual content, do people submit their work to you, or do you seek out submissions from specific writers or photographers?
We do both. We have a team of readers who read our unsolicited submissions, and at this point, we get about 1,000 submissions a week.
A week?
A week of unsolicited writing.
Okay.
So we have a team of folks who help us get through the unsolicited submissions, and really anybody on staff, but I think it tends to be people on the editorial staff. If you read a piece, say, in another publication that you thought, wow, that is just really good, and I've never read that writer before, we always reach out to those people and say, I read your piece in The Atlantic, or whatever it was, and I really love your writing. Is there anything that you have that you feel would be a good fit for the Sun? So we do both of those things. We accept unsolicited submissions all year round, and we get, like I said, about 1,000 a week. And then we also reach out to people whose writing we admire and see if they're interested in being in the Sun as well.
Yeah. Now, as someone who grew up writing and studied writing and now finds yourself on the editorial staff, how does what you do now line up with where you thought your writing career would take you?
That's such a good question. I don't know that I thought, there was never a point, I'll say with certainty, I don't think there was ever a point where I said, I'm going to work at a magazine.
Yeah.
And I think part of that was that, like I said, I had gotten that Sun mailer when I was young, but for the most part, magazines didn't really appeal to me that much.
Right.
Because there aren't a lot of them like the Sun. And so when I sit at my desk at work now, we have this retrofitted house. It used to be a house and now it's our offices. And when I sit in my office in that house that is the Sun, I think, wow, this is exactly what I was looking for, because it's such a great place to be and to be engaged in this kind of work that is meaningful to me and meaningful to all of these people who read the magazine. So I don't know if I would have said before that was exactly what I was looking for, but it's been such a good fit for me, and I love getting to work with the people that I work with and do the things that I'm so really, really privileged to get to be a part of.
Yeah. Now, do you read the unsolicited submissions?
Not really.
Okay.
I'm not one of that team of readers who reads all of that stuff that's coming in. Once it's gone through a few readers, we'll have editorial meetings each month where there are pieces that we are unsure about and that we think we might want to publish, but we're not sure if we want to publish, or we want to maybe suggest some changes, things like that. So I do read those manuscripts.
Okay.
But a lot of my job really isn't spent reading. There's a section, and I'll just explain it really quickly, though I'm sure you're familiar with it. There's a section of the magazine called Reader's Right.
Mm-hmm.
And Reader's Right is basically where we provide a topic and our readers send us in these sort of like short little vignettes about that topic. So for instance, we just, in our June issue, which is the one that we're finishing up right now, we'll be publishing Making Love. So we gave the topic of making love, and readers write in on making love. So these people who are writing in are not necessarily professional writers, though they might be. And I was reading those submissions, and that I just recently actually switched, and that task moved to somebody else, and I moved to doing a different part of that work. So I was reading some stuff, but it's not it's not the biggest part of my day.
Okay. Now, when you asked for submissions for Making Love, were you intending to take away from the Penthouse letter forum?
Penthouse has this monopoly on stories about doing it, and we thought, it's time for the Sun to get a piece of that. And no, I have to say, I think
it's a new market for the Sun.
Exactly. Nothing could better illustrate the difference between the Sun and the Penthouse than the Making Love Reader's Right section and the type of writing that's in that, and then the Penthouse letters to I forget what they're called.
Yeah, I don't remember.
Right.
So I'm curious, though, as someone now, as someone who's on an editorial staff and someone who at one point in time, you admit that you were a little unsure, a little afraid to submit your own stuff for publication somewhere. Has your experience with the Sun changed your perspective on how you looked at it then, or given you some sort of interesting way to look at it when you are dealing with new writers?
Yeah, I'm like so ridiculous about it now because, like I said, we just had this conference, where you're getting to tell people about the magazine, and people would come up and I'd say, are you familiar with the Sun? And they'd say yes or no, and we'd tell them about the magazine, and I would say, do you submit your work to us? And they'd say no, and I would ask them why, and they would be like, oh, I don't know, it's this big magazine and I'm afraid, and it just seems totally ridiculous to me. It's like there's this group of people who are anxious to read your writing, why don't you just send it to them? So I'm like totally flipped on my point of view on this, which is that nobody should be afraid to submit to us. They should submit the thing that, if anything, they should be afraid to write. They should be writing the thing that they're afraid to write and then sending that to us. The writing is the harder part. You know? And the sending is it's almost the easier part in a lot of ways, because you're just putting it out in the world. And I understand the reason for the fear, because nobody likes to be rejected. And given that we get 1,000 submissions a week and we only publish a monthly magazine, we do have to send a lot of rejections. But I will say that just because we are rejecting a piece, it really doesn't necessarily mean that the quality of the writing is bad. We have absolutely rejected pieces that I have seen published elsewhere in very, very good magazines that have gone on to win awards and things like that. So it's not a reflection on the quality of the writing, it's just a reflection on it didn't feel like it was right for the Sun. And you never know all of the things that are going on in the background of a magazine. Maybe we had just accepted 3 pieces that were on a very similar topic and we knew that we didn't have room for that and we wouldn't be able to publish it within the next year or something like that, and so that's why we didn't take it. There's a million different reasons that a piece might get rejected, and to assume that it's because your writing is lousy is like the worst way to read that rejection.
Is there a specific type of submission that you are either looking for more of, or that you are just inundated with and just can't keep up?
Well, we usually say that we often don't know what we like until we read it. Just as a for instance, we had this piece that was this sort of allegory. It was called "The Hogs, the Sow, the Wind," and the author was David Rutschman. And it was this sort of allegory about these hogs who were stuck in this pen, and their owner, the farmer, had died, and they didn't know how they were going to get their next meal. In a million years, I would have never said, that's the kind of writing we need, is an allegory about pigs. And yet, they sent, we got this submission, and we just thought it was terrific, and we ended up publishing it. So I'm so reluctant to say, this is the kind of stuff that we need, and this is the kind of stuff that we don't want to see, because if somebody had pitched that to me, I'd be like, I don't know, actually, I'm not sure that sounds right for the Sun. And that's why we don't really accept pitches except for our interviews, because you can pitch a thing and you don't really know the quality of it until you actually see it.
Right.
So we don't know what we like until we see it, and we like those surprises.
Is there a specific topic that the Sun just won't publish anything on?
I don't think so.
So it's just a matter of presentation, no matter what the topic is?
Yeah, I would say if there's sort of any like hard lines that we draw, like we probably would not publish like a strict romance piece.
Okay.
We don't publish.
And we all say
that
thank
would
you.
Yeah. And we don't publish anything that would be young adult reading. We do publish some science fiction, but it's what I would, and I don't like to draw this dichotomy between the two, but I would say it's sort of like literary science fiction. So it still exercises a lot of the same muscles that a piece of literary fiction would, but it's also speculative, or it has portals in it or something strange like that. But we wouldn't publish just, things that fall really hard into their genres. It has to be accessible to a larger audience. We have about 75,000 subscribers, and so we're, as we're putting together each issue, we're thinking about what would connect with that many readers.
Right. I'm sure, with 75,000 subscribers, you guys aren't necessarily hurting for readership, but if somebody did want to subscribe, how would they go about doing that?
We were very lucky. We have just recently revamped our website, and I'm so proud of it. I think it's really handsome.
It does look very nice.
Yeah, I think they did such a terrific job, and I love the website. But anyway, you would go to thesunmagazine.org, and there's a button at the top that says subscribe, and you follow the prompts there and enter your information and get a subscription. I really do think that it's a exceptionally unique magazine, that we publish things that you might not find in other places, and I would say it's worth it, but of course I'm biased.
Well, I also think it's worth it for anybody who's looking for something a little bit deeper and more meaningful than you get in most of the supermarket rags these days.
Right. There's an occasional supermarket that you can find that will have the Sun.
Oh, not up this way.
Really?
No, not that I've ever seen.
Most of our sales are through subscriptions. Almost all of them are, but we do have some newsstand sales through like co-ops. You might be able to find us at like some Whole Foods, and then of course independent booksellers will often carry the magazine as well. Bookstores are probably a better shot small bookstores are probably a better shot of finding the Sun on the shelf than supermarkets, but some supermarkets do.
What about social media? Is the Sun on any of the socials these days?
We are Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and where you would follow us would just be at The Sun Magazine. We'll post covers of the magazine and some photos that have appeared in the magazine, and we're also trying to take some more candid shots and post those to Instagram.
Mm-hmm.
And then our Twitter feed is, we've tried really just within the last couple of months to do some things that are sort of specific to that format. And Twitter, you know, I'm sure, Jordan, you have your own thoughts on Twitter.
But everybody's got 120 character thought on Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. But we've been doing a few more things on there to try to engage people and even find, you know, a new audience, people who aren't familiar with the magazine. So we are on all of those, and then some of the we'll just like share things from our archives on Facebook and things like that. And it's also a great place where people who do read the magazine can tell us about it. One of my favorite parts of the magazine, it's one of the parts that I get to work on, is the correspondence section that's at the beginning of each issue, where people, our readers, write in and tell us what they think about the things that we publish. And so Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, to a lesser extent, get to be like this kind of miniature version of that, where people talk just a little bit about the magazine.
Yeah. Now, I mentioned before that one of my favorite things is that you can go back and read an older issue and still find something very relevant and interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to go back into the archives, even if you haven't been a subscriber, to be able to go back to stuff from the 90s or the early 2000s and see what was done there?
Part of redoing the website was digitizing our entire archive. Everything back to 1974 is available to read on our website.
Everything?
Every single thing. We had a team of folks working on that, and we're really excited to get to share everything that stretches back to the very first article in the magazine.
Wow, that's incredible.
And there's a button just at the top of the website, as I had said, where the subscribe one was. There's one that says read, and you can go back and through the decades, and if you're a subscriber, you have access to all of that stuff, and you can read as much as you'd like. And if you're not a subscriber, you get, I think it's 2 articles per month, and then it'll say, you know, if you'd like to read more of the archives or the current stuff, then you have to subscribe.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. That's considering how long it's been around and how much wonderful work has been done. That's really a great resource for the interviews and you know the fiction work that's been published. That's amazing. I'm gonna have to go scrub through that myself and see what I can find.
Yeah, and it's great to see how these pieces might find new life. We had this really great piece by an author, Brian Doyle. And he unfortunately just passed away this past year in 2018. But he wrote it was a piece of nonfiction. It was called Dawn and Mary, and it was about 2 teachers who were trying to stop an active shooter during a school shooting. And every time, and unfortunately, this is something, as I'm sure you know, that is happening with regularity, it seems like every time that there's another school shooting, which is such a horrible thing to have to say.
I still can't wrap my head around how often we have to say that these days.
I know. It's awful. And it's interesting to me to see how that piece gets shared in the light of that sort of tragic news. It's a really touching piece. I don't want to put too many adjectives on it, but it's a piece that I really love, and I love his writing. So we're glad that we have the archives out there and that people can read and connect with that stuff.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I appreciate it so much.
Yeah, this has been a delight.
I'm glad.
My mom taught me not to talk too much about myself.
Well,
but yeah, this has really been great.
How are you feeling right now?
I feel good.
All right, I'll take good.
Should I say exceptional?
You can say whatever you want as long as it's true.
No, yeah, just put me somewhere between good and exceptional.
Thank you again to Derek Askey for coming on the show to talk about The Sun magazine. I would genuinely encourage you to at least visit thesunmagazine.org and take advantage of those 2 free articles each month, and to subscribe if you can. There really is something in there for everyone. Now, as always, I encourage you to leave a rating or a review of Table to Stage on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or whatever service you use to listen to your podcasts. Those dang ratings really do make a big difference in the world of podcasts. And of course, if you haven't already clicked on the subscribe button, you should definitely go ahead and do that. Now, if you'd like to get more involved and maybe a little bit more concrete with your support of the show, then maybe a visit to patreon.com/tabletostage is in order. You can get advanced access to episodes, discounts on merch, and you really do make a huge difference in my ability to continue producing this thing. All right, that's going to do it for this round. Until next time, keep creating.